Welcome. This video is intended for teachers and others participating in a summer workshop at Michigan State University through the Teaching About East Asia program. In this very short video, I'm going to be introducing the novel Botchan by the Meiji period Japanese author Natsume Soseki, which is one of the texts that we're reading for this workshop. My name is Ethan Siegel. I'm a faculty member in the History Department here at MSU, and I'm delighted to spend a few minutes with you here today. Because we hope to discuss this book during the summer workshop, it is really crucial that those of you who are participating take the time to read the novel before the workshop begins. Because the workshop is an intensive one, I don't think you'll have time to try to complete it during the days of the workshop itself. Hopefully this video will provide you with a bit of context, because although Botchan is an interesting and I think even funny book in its own right, and certainly worth reading on its own merits, we're also asking you to read it because it reflects a certain moment in history that we hope to talk about as part of the workshop. First, I'll talk briefly about the author and the book's reception. So Natsume Soseki is widely regarded as one of modern Japan's greatest authors. You see his visage here on the 1,000-yen note. His books are still widely read today, including Botchan, the title that we are discussing. Perhaps his most famous novel is this one, Kokoro, which came much later in his career as an author. It's more psychologically deep and sophisticated, I think, than Botchan, and it's one I highly recommend, although it is longer than the novel that we will be reading and might be difficult to use in a classroom. Botchan is also a wonderful book. It is sometimes compared to Catcher in the Rye and read by many school children and adults in Japan even today, over 100 years after its initial publication. You can find it available in several different translations in English. You see one in the top left there, as well as in other languages, as you see in the middle image. And you can find manga versions, anime versions, movie versions, and so on. It's almost certain that any well-read Japanese person you meet will at least be familiar with Botchan. The author was an important intellectual and literary figure in Japan's Meiji period, which runs from 1868 to 1912. He spent some time studying literature in England and went on to produce many very famous works, as I've alluded to already. Early in his career, he did spend some time on the island of Shikoku, which is south of the main island of Honshu, where he worked as a middle school or high school teacher. And that experience provided some of the inspiration for this novel, Botchan, for as you will see, the main character also travels from Tokyo to a provincial city where he becomes a school teacher. The main character in the book is referred to only as Botchan, which is a term of endearment that his nursemaid, Kiyo, gives to him. We never learn his actual name. In the novel, Botchan travels to this provincial city sometime around the year 1905, and we know the setting not because it's specified, but because later in the novel, the people in the town seem to be celebrating Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War, which ended in 1905. In this provincial town, Botchan has a variety of adventures with his students and with the fellow teachers that I think reflect some of the tensions of the time, as Japan was undergoing major changes from an older, samurai-dominated society to a newer, Western-influenced one. Let me explain. I'll try to provide a very quick cursory overview of 19th century Japanese history in the next few minutes. We'll go over this material in greater detail during the workshop itself, but this will, I hope, provide you some context for the novel. If you have the Ebry and Walthall Modern East Asia textbook, then you might look at the chapter Meiji Transformation for more information. In the early 19th century, Japan was governed by the Tokugawa shoguns, who ruled over an administration of samurai. This government had come to power around the year 1600, bringing an end to more than a century of civil war, and so it was determined to prevent war from breaking out again. As a result, it established a number of policies devised to assure control and promote stability, including, for example, the implementation of a relatively rigid four-class social hierarchy. It also strictly regulated contact with foreign countries. The only European power with which the Japanese had contact at this time was the Dutch. There were also limited contacts with the Chinese, the Koreans, and the Ryukyuans, but they were very heavily regulated. It was very concerned about religion and required all common people to have an affiliation at a Buddhist temple, and Christianity was made illegal during these years. Finally, in order to keep the samurai off the battlefield, it set in place policies that encouraged the samurai to become the equivalent of civil servants. They often had desk jobs, they were administrators, and no longer did samurai take to the battlefield, at least not very often. Now, this system worked well in some regards. It did in fact keep peace. There were very few incidents of actual fighting during the Tokugawa period. It also allowed the population to grow and led to many more people living in cities. Japan was one of the most urbanized countries in the world in, say, the 17th and 18th centuries, with perhaps as many as 15% of the population living in cities. You see in the images on the right, first the growth of the city of Edo on the top, which later became the city that we know as Tokyo, or at the bottom, a mid-17th century picture depicting a commercial district in that same city. It also allowed the economy to grow, and we saw a nationwide exchange of goods and even the development of specialized products associated with certain regions, such as plums from Mito or iron kettles made in Nambu. And you'll see occasional references to this as you read Botchan. There were some downsides, though, as well. There were a number of very severe famines that the government proved unable to adequately address. The four-class hierarchy led to significant social stratification and very limited opportunity for mobility. So no matter how ambitious you might be or talented you might be, there were few opportunities to move up the social hierarchy. Women saw a decline in their status and in their rights. The government, which was not elected or in any way representative, had little connection to the common people. And so by the early to mid-19th century, even many samurai came to feel alienated from the government. We'll talk more about why that was the case during our summer workshop. In the midst of this situation came pressure from various Western powers for Japan to open up relations with them. The British, the Russians, and finally the Americans all came knocking at the door, and it was the Americans, led by Commodore Perry, who in the 1850s sailed into Edo Bay and basically forced the Japanese to sign the so-called Kanagawa Treaty of Friendship in 1854. You see photographs of the Japanese and the English versions of it there in the top left. This led to additional treaties, and all of these treaties were grouped under the category of unequal treaties. That is, the Western imperial powers made sure that their best interests were looked out for. The Japanese were not able to do so. And again, we'll explain more about these treaties when we meet together during the summer. The result was, over the next 14 to 15 years, from the mid-1850s until the late 1860s, Japan was in turmoil. There were extensive debates among samurai and others over whether or not the Tokugawa government was still fit to rule. It had failed in one of what people thought of as its key functions, which was protecting Japan's borders. It had proven itself weak in the face of a foreign threat. And of course, all of these other problems that I alluded to, the problems with the social system, problems with samurai finding themselves increasingly living in poverty, while merchants, who were supposed to be their inferiors, were in some cases enjoying lives of luxury. Problems with the system that prevented even talented samurai from moving up into positions of greater importance meant that many people were unhappy. This finally came to a head in the mid to late 1860s when two southwestern domains, Satsuma and Choshu, formed an alliance, and due to a variety of circumstances, were able in January of 1868 to, with the support of a teenage emperor, declare a restoration of imperial power. This led to a short-lived war known as the Botchan War, and when these forces proved victorious, they created a new government for Japan known as the Meiji government. And this period of time is then known as Japan's Meiji period, and you see its years at the top of the slide. This government was quite different from what had preceded it. It was a new state centered on the figure of the emperor rather than the shogun as the key head of state. It was committed to revising these unequal treaties that the Japanese had signed with the Americans, the British, the French, and other European powers. It was also committed to making Japan into a modern nation. The Japanese realized that it was impossible for them to survive as an independent country if they did not modernize along the lines of the Western imperial powers. They had seen what had happened to China, which had been defeated by the British in the Opium War of 1839 to 1842. They knew they needed to learn Western technology, Western governance, etc. And ultimately, this new government eliminated samurai status, which is a bit surprising given it was led by samurai in the first place. They also had to take a number of steps to unify the country, to promote nationalism, and to create a sense of national unity. Because during the Tokugawa period, although the Tokugawa family monopolized the office of shogun and dominated the country, in fact there were over 200 semi-independent domains, sometimes referred to as feudal domains, that were to a large degree autonomous, and they each had their own sense of identity. So the country needed to be rebuilt, in a sense, have a strong sense of Japaneseness. And there were a number of things this new Meiji government did to promote such an identity. They got rid of the old social hierarchy and the class distinctions. They redrew the boundaries, creating new prefectures. A prefecture in Japan is kind of similar to a state in our country. It's a unit less than the national unit, which came to have head of state that we call the governor. It forced many small villages to merge into larger administrative units, both because that was easier for the government to handle and because it forced people to rethink their identity. It made Shinto the state religion, with the emperor revered as a Shinto deity. It instituted a draft so that all young men of a certain age, regardless of where they came from, served in the military together. And if any of you have served in the military, then you know one easy way to help these young men build strong bonds of commonality is to make them suffer through basic training together or go through service overseas together. And finally, it instituted compulsory elementary school education, initially through 4th grade, then through 6th grade, and over time that would increase. And all of these things helped people, regardless of what region of Japan they came from, to develop a common sense of identity. Very quickly, by the 1870s and 1880s, we begin to see signs of Western influence in Japan. Western-style buildings like those you see in the images here. Quickly, Japan developed a subway, a streetcar system. Japanese were sent abroad to study things in the West. Factories and industrial process was introduced. The military was modernized, so you see in the top right there an image of the Meiji Emperor looking very much like any proud European monarch. And the train became the symbol of modernity, and trains and ideas associated with trains became commonplace. Japan also went to war, first against the biggest power, the traditional power in its region, China, and in 1894, 1895 fought a war against the Chinese, largely over which country would be dominant in Korea. This was a war that the Japanese won handily. And you see here a political cartoon depicting a Japanese diplomat dressed in a Western-style coat and tails, dictating the terms of the peace treaty to a rather befuddled-looking Chinese person there who doesn't really seem to know what's going on. Just 10 years later, they fought a second war, this time against Russia. And much to the world's surprise, as this political cartoon shows, Japan, little upstart Japan, wins and beats old man Russia. Many people expected Russia, which was thought of as much more of a Western power, that the Russians would win this war easily, but they were defeated. Perhaps you're familiar with this from the very famous peace treaty signed at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, negotiated by Teddy Roosevelt. By the end of the Meiji era, Japan had accomplished many of the goals that its leaders had set out for the country. They had managed to get the Western powers to revise the unequal treaties. They had introduced a constitution and a parliamentary democracy, became the only non-Western nation to industrialize, to hold colonies, etc., etc. But that doesn't mean these things didn't come at a price. There was tremendous debate within the country over retaining a Japanese identity, over not trying to slavishly follow Western models, and over where the country's values lie. So there was a price that was paid, and many people were sorry about this. And some of this reflects the tensions that we're going to read about in our novel. So let me turn to the reading then. As you'll discover in this novel, Botchan has a wonderful penchant for giving nicknames to the other teachers he meets. It's another reason why I like using this novel with teachers like yourselves or students who maybe aren't familiar with the Japanese language, because you'll probably find it much easier to remember a teacher nicknamed Porcupine than his given name in Japanese. So characters like Porcupine, Redshirt, the Hanger-On, the Madonna, and things like this are the characters you're going to meet. And as I think you will discover, they have some very different values that they try to convey to Botchan, and he's torn as to which side he should follow. Perhaps fooled, we might say. I don't want to say too much more about it. I hope this provides some of the context that you need to understand why, although, as I said, it's a wonderful novel in its own right, perhaps one you'll relate to as a teacher who dealt with students for the first time when you read how he has his students pulling pranks on him. But it also reflects this moment of tension where Botchan represents kind of these older samurai values, and some of the characters that he meets, the other teachers he meets, share those values, whereas others seem very much taken by new Western ideas, and they behave very differently. I've given you 5 sets of questions here that you might think about. I hope you'll think about anyway as you read the book. And perhaps, I'm not asking you to turn anything in, but if you wouldn't mind jotting down a few notes to yourself so that when we come to the novel, you can refresh your own memory and contribute to discussion. I think we'll all get a lot more out of the reading of this book if we're able to talk about it, and if you have some sense of your own ideas about the novel. Of course, any questions you have, bring those as well. Thank you very much.